This talk was given by Roshi Martin, guiding teacher of the Endless Path Zendo, a lay Buddhist community in Rochester, New York. Join our practice, in person or online, at endlesspathzendo.org.
So it is very hot. Our air conditioning is out. Of course, the replacement is on the way. We wisely got a warranty when we bought our big air conditioner. Unfortunately, it won't arrive till midweek. So let me give you a little Zen anecdote. Once a monk, a student, came to a teacher and said, how can I escape heat and cold? The teacher said, why don't you go to the place where there is no heat or cold? And the student said, where is this place where there is no heat or cold? And the teacher said, when it's hot, let the heat kill you. When it's cold, let the cold kill you. So, today I'm going to do something I haven't done for quite a while, and I don't think I've done it in sesshin actually at all, which is to read and comment rather than giving a written teisho that I've created. This was quite an extraordinary person connected with Philip Kapleau, his training in Japan, and that was Tangen. Now Tangen, or was, he's since deceased, Tangen Harada Roshi. It was Harada Roshi's adopted son. Was the monk Tangen-san in the Three Pillars of Zen. He was a tremendous support and encouragement to Philip Kapleau when he was struggling with this practice. A middle-aged man transplanted into a Japanese Zen monastery, living on rice and miso, having a hell of a time. And Sunyana Roshi and her community went to visit Tangen Roshi in one of their early pilgrimages to Japan. Dane and Henry Roshi, my transmission teacher, spent time with Tangen Roshi. He was so deeply moved by him. And Dharma Storts, Shakya, monk who was a good friend, spent 3 to 6 months every year for the last many years training with Tangen Roshi. So there's a new book that is a compilation of many of his talks and his biography, which is quite extraordinary. So it's called Throw Yourself into the House of Buddha. And this is the book I'm going to read from and comment on for the 4 days of this sesshin. This is the first day of our 4-day June 2024 sesshin. So let's really start at the beginning, because you need to know something about him. Daisetsu Tangen Harada Roshi, called Roshi Sama with respect and affection by his students, was born as Usao Abe in the city of Niigata on August 24th, 1924. Narrowly surviving World War II, as you will see in his autobiography. He was haunted by his war experiences, human suffering, and the question of life and death. He entered Hoshinji, the famous Zen monastery in the town of Obama, where he practiced under one of the most significant Zen masters of modern Japan, Dayan Sogaku Harada Roshi, who you'll know if you've ever read the Three Pillars of Zen, and of course he began the lineage that we are in, as he was a Soto monk who left the Soto establishment in order to train in Rinzai koan practice, because he felt the sense of realization, real enlightenment, was so chimerical, vague in his Soto practice. He found that only by leaving it and committing himself to koan practice could he really gain what he was looking for. And then out of him came Yasutani Roshi, Yamada Roshi, Aitken Roshi, Kapleau-Roshi, and through this combined Harada Yasutani koan lineage, one of the most influential of all koan lineages in the West. Interestingly, in Japan, it was quite marginal because it wasn't pure. It wasn't this and it wasn't that. It was a hybrid. So in any way, Harada Roshi's name became very well known through the Three Pillars of Zen. But Mayuzumi Roshi was in that lineage, Eiken Roshi, not Edo, but Daido, many others really truly benefited from as we have. This is our lineage as well. So he was, Tangen Roshi was ordained by Harada Roshi and gave him the name Tangen. After intense training, his realization was confirmed, and he received Dharma transmission and Inka Shomei at the age of 27. Tangen Roshi then served as a personal attendant to Daiyun Roshi for several years, co-leading practice at Hoshinji, while living together with his teacher in a small hermitage just outside the gate. In 1955, Tangen Roshi became the abbot of the neighboring temple of Bokukuji at the request of his teacher. From that time on, for almost 60 years, Tangen Roshi received at Bokukuji anyone who was willing to follow his austere lifestyle and his guidance in practice, not discriminating between lay and monastic or by gender or nationality. He didn't travel the world to spread his Dharma. He just sat in his small temple, nestled in the shadow of a little mountain on the outskirts of a fishing town by the Sea of Japan. Yet slowly word of him spread around the world, bringing thousands of people from all continents to practice there. Tangen Roshi taught tirelessly. He gave countless teisho, monthly public Dharma talks on the day, especially celebrating the Bodhisattva Kannon, and at formal tea on bath days, which is a monastic schedule, as well as on other occasions. Unlike the customary Japanese teisho, which is traditionally a commentary on a classic text, let's say on a koan text, most of Tangen Roshi's talks were not based on the Zen canon, but were spontaneous expressions of his realization, delivered without any preparation. When speaking, depending on the audience, the tone of his talks differed. When speaking during sesshin to his own students who were undergoing training, Tangen was more intense and strict, directly pointing out both realized perspective and delusion, trying to push his listeners beyond their limits. When giving talks to a general audience, for instance, speaking to rice farmers from the neighborhood, he was much gentler and emphasized the inherent perfection underlying all existence. Interestingly, Hakuin was very much like this, extremely strict and forceful with his own students, very gentle and nurturing with the local population, because he was a parish priest, as was Tangen, as well as a teacher of students who had flocked to work with him. Since the readers of this book in the West will be most likely Zen or Buddhist practitioners, the talks presented here are mostly excerpts taken from teisho given to students at retreats. Trying to do justice to Tangen Roshi's teachings is not an easy task, primarily because when listening to him, it was always very clear that the words, even if often beautiful and poetic, were of secondary importance. What was most important was the place from which he was speaking, the depth of his wisdom, the boundless compassion and warmth he radiated, as well as the great Dharma energy expressed in his voice. Always during sesshin in the middle of teisho, one of the monks had to go out of the zendo and strike the main temple bell at 11 a.m. Once when I was assigned this job, and this is the editor, Kogen Sarnik, speaking in this introduction. I was leaving the zendo as Tangen Roshi was speaking, and I looked up and saw a row of foreigners on the meditation platform next to the stairs. None of them understood Japanese, but all of them had tears flowing down their cheeks. My hope is that some of this presence may be conveyed to the reader from the words on these pages. For someone who never met Tangen Roshi, his talks may sound like they speak of a far-off, unreachable ideal. And indeed, that's why when I first came across this book, which was recently published, I didn't know if I would ever read from it. But as I began to read it more and more, I was really so moved by what he's expressing. And it seemed perfect for sesshin to touch base with Tangen Roshi. So let us go on. But the complementary part of those teachings was living with him and seeing that during practice, work, meals, drinking tea, or begging, he was living to the letter everything he was preaching. All those big words were perfectly translated into all the small situations of his daily life. When a young girl from the neighborhood came and asked him to perform a funeral for her dead rabbit, Tangen Roshi put on his best robes and conducted a beautiful, full-length funeral service. When a senior monk wanted to check his understanding, Tangen Roshi would be ready to see him in Doksan at any time. When there was temple-related office work to do, Tangen Roshi would work late into the night alone, enabling his students to focus only on their practice. When one of his students would snooze during Zazen, Tangen Roshi would get up and strike the person with the kiyosaku. Now, we don't use the kiyosaku here. Dainin Henry Roshi no longer used it. He actually had one of his students who was trained in yoga to go around periodically during a round of sitting in sesshin and correct people's postures to get them into the right spine, really, because often people slump and their organs droop and they make it harder, or their head drops, and you make it harder for yourself. So he would have someone go around and correct someone's posture very gently. Sunyana Roshi dispensed with the kiyosaku, except a tiny miniaturized version of it, a little flat stick, almost kind of like a flattened pencil, very small. And she would only use it before Doksan, when she would have the monitors go around the entire Zendo, and they have a very big Zendo. Tap, 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 tap. And they don't do that anymore either. Okay, so they've dispensed with it entirely. When I was training with Diamond Sangha, with Aiken Roshi and Nelson Foster Roshi, they did use the kiyosaku, but it was only by request. It was not, you sat there and you got hit. If you wanted it, you raised your hands palm to palm, and the monitor would come around and tap, 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 sometimes more forcefully than that. And the point really is that there are two acupuncture meridians on the shoulders, and the hitting is really to energize. It's not punishment. It's not to hurt. Done well, it doesn't hurt, but it really energizes. However, for Westerners, it brings up so many issues. Plus, so much of Western practice is lay practice. And to be honest, lay people get enough hits in their life. We have enough motivation coming our way with the issues of relationship, of work, of bills, of being citizens in a very polarized time, and citizens of the earth with its threatened life on earth. There's enough pressure on lay people that if you come to practice, believe me, I trust, you have motivation. Sure, you may get tired at times, and you may wonder what you're doing sometimes, but the motivation to wake up and be of benefit to all beings is there. Monks are in a different situation. They're surrounded by people who look like them, dress like them, are in an environment that's set up just to keep them in a Buddhist mind. Jobs are focused. Someone does the cooking, somebody does the washing, So the stick becomes very important, because monks do long hours of zazen, and you will get sleepy, you will get tired, and so the kiyosaku is important in a monastic style practice. But for lay people, most teachers I know have essentially dispensed with it or only use it by request. Anyway, to go on. Tangen Roshi used the kiyosaku when he did this when someone was sleeping forcefully, but at the same time with deep compassion and kindness. When a kitten would lay on Tangen Roshi's cushions in the Zendo Before the start of morning chanting, he would spread his zagu, which is the monk's bowing cloth. Before the start of morning chanting, he would spread his zagu on bare tatami and let the kitten continue to sleep on his place through the chanting. So he wouldn't disturb the kitten. He would do his chanting on bare tatami, which can be somewhat painful. It's stiff stuff. Tangen Roshi saw a Buddha in everyone and everything. He treated those he encountered in this way without differentiating between big and small, important and not important, enlightened and deluded. Yet at the same time, Tangen Roshi would tirelessly guide his students to what he himself had realized, demanding that they give their all to their practice, just as he did. No matter if someone stayed at Pukokuchi for 30 years or just one day, everybody was struck by his living example of bodhisattva life. So now, let's turn to the life story, which is where this begins. The gift of life. I came into this world with a great debt. My mother gave her own life in order to give birth to me. She'd already had 3 children, and when she was pregnant with me, she was diagnosed with stomach cancer. The doctor urged her to apologize to the baby and to have the cancer removed from her stomach. Those around her, my father as well, tried to persuade her to do it, but she stood firm, vowing, "This baby in my belly is going to be born." I was born on August 24th, the day we worship Jizo Bodhisattva. After that, it was too late for the surgery. Just before she died, she very clearly expressed herself to those close to her. "Even after I die, I will care for and protect this child." She must have prayed fiercely for my protection. She died before my first birthday and left me in the care of Jizo Bodhisattva. When I was still very young, when I came to understand what my mother had done for me, I wrote on a piece of paper, "My mother laid down her life for me. What does she mean for me to do with this gift?" I continuously wondered what it was that I should do with this life. What was my mother telling me? Yet I was terribly dissatisfied as a child. I could not be calm. Of course, I was guided by greed, anger, and ignorance. I was overtaken by wants, creating seeds of pain. I lived immersed in dualistic thinking. It was a miserable childhood. When I was about 12 years old, a deep questioning arose in me. Whenever I felt a touch of wind or looked up at the sky overhead, I would ask myself, what is there deep down beneath the surface of things? When I would eat an orange, for instance, I wouldn't think of its taste or color, but I would wonder, what is there? There is something I feel but don't understand. I sense its presence but can't take hold of it. My inability to answer these questions was a source of such discontentment that I always felt separated from people and things. Around that time, I was playing tennis, and I was good at it. I was asked to join the team. I gave my all to practice, even in the rain or when it grew dark, I would stay with it. I would ride home on a bicycle after dark, past shops with their lights shining brightly. The streets were still bustling with people at the time. There were old people, young people, people in between, and as I rode through the streets with groups of people passing under the bright lights, I would be asking myself, there is life. And all these people are living it. But what is this life? There is something. There is something. I was still young when I showed to myself that I would always do what really needed to be done. That I vowed to myself that I would always do what really needed to be done. That I would pour myself into whatever was before me to do. I vowed that. At about 16 years old, I became driven to really question myself, to reflect upon myself, asking, who is the most good-for-nothing person around? The weakest, the laziest, the most useless one around. I knew deep in my heart that it was I, the weakest-willed one of all, and I beat myself up over this. There was a time I struggled so hard that I actually managed to knock my own jaw out of place. I couldn't stand myself for thinking ill of others. I couldn't stand it that I would dislike others. I saw myself as so pitiful. My own habits, my own character were unbearable to me. At 17 years old, I had the good fortune to read a book called Inshitsuroku by Ryoban, who was a noted scholar from the Ming Dynasty, and that's around 1600. This is a book of instruction the author compiled for his son. The term inshitsu means to be decided without one's being aware of it. It's like vows. I think in the prelude, Wordsworth has a line, "I did not make vows, but vows were made for me." That is, they arise out of our deepest nature. It's not consciously, I'm making this vow, it's, I did not make vows, but vows were made for me. I think that's very similar, to be decided without one's being aware of it, self-consciously aware of it. That is to say that the fortunes that befall a person, sunshine and shadows, ups and downs, are naturally determined without his knowing it by his own past actions, virtue and vice. Upon carefully reading this book, it became clear to me that there is a path to be followed, and I resolved then to follow that path. According to the book, the author, N. Ryoban, first came to deeply believe in karmic retribution through a fortune teller, a man named Ko. He then met with Zen master Unkoko, who impressed upon him that karma is only one side of the picture. Yes, so what is the other side? Thus he writes to Tenkei, his son, that one can take responsibility for the construction of one's world. It is not a matter of living out one's life wedged into a predetermined mold, but rather by virtue of one's own efforts, it is possible to move, if even just a step, closer towards one's aim. From childhood on, I had been in search of something, and had always been a rather rebellious youth. I kept thinking that I had never really been given the opportunity to understand the reason for living. I did not care much for Buddhist priests. I had the preconceived idea that they wore funny clothes, talked a lot of nonsense, and led lives of comfort and ease. But N. Ryoban's book really addressed itself to that something I had been searching for. And it surprised me to realize the lesson came through a Buddhist priest. Although Inshitsuroku is at heart a Confucian text rather than Buddhist, it is a Zen master who clearly points the way. Incidentally, the man who translated the book into Japanese, Tangen Harada Roshi, was to become my Zen teacher 5 years later. Also Philip Kapleau's teacher. I then resolved to become like a chair. A chair doesn't refuse its services to anybody. After it just takes care of the sitter and lets them rest their legs. After it has served its purpose, no one gets up and gives thanks or offers words of kindness to the chair. It will more likely get kicked out of the way. The chair doesn't grumble or complain or bear a grudge, but just takes whatever is given. A chair doesn't plop itself down on top of the sitter, right? When there's a job to be done, it puts forth all its energy without picking and choosing according to its desires. I thought, wouldn't it be great to have such a heart? I wrote on a big sheet of paper, "Be like a chair." And every day I took note of how close I came. If even a little dissatisfaction arose, I would regard that as a disgraceful state of mind. For a chair, I considered how thoroughly I was of use to others. What was positive about all that was that if I possibly could, I wanted to put others before myself. The endeavor was not at all forced or unnatural. It arose from life itself and was enjoyable, not painful. During the time I was following this practice, I went to climb Mount Kinpoku, a rather small mountain of the Chukoku Pass near the town of Yugawara. As I climbed that day, I could think of nothing but my own selfishness. Shedding tears, I repeatedly reflected and repeated thinking, I'm no good, I'm no good, as I made the 30-minute ascent on the mountain trail. There was a large stone statue on the flat crest of the mountain. If I saw it today, I might know what it was, but at the time I had no idea. Along the way, there'd been a number of figures of Kannon, Bodhisattva of compassion. So I think perhaps this statue was of Shakyamuni Buddha. In those days, I knew nothing of Buddhism or of paying homage to its founder. I had, however, committed to memory a text by Shoin Yoshida, who was a major intellectual of the mid-late 1800s in Japan. And it was inspiring to me, and I began to chant it in front of the Buddha statue, if that's what it was. Through chanting, I must have entered into a purer state of mind. Then I crossed to the other side of the mountain, which formed a precipice. A valley had been gouged out below, and beyond the valley stretched the Pacific Ocean. To one side, I could see the rolling hills of the Izu Peninsula. Transfixed by the mountain landscape, I was standing just on the edge of the cliff. There I was, asking for nothing. I wasn't thinking or analyzing. I was adding nothing. The wind began to gust up towards me from the valley below. I became enveloped by the wind. I felt as if I were growing bigger and bigger. At that moment, I realized that I was supported by heaven and earth, by all things. I was being told, all things are becoming you, nurturing you. Looking at the mountain was me. The wide, wide valley became me. I realized then whatever I heard, whatever I saw, everything is always and forever supporting me, caring for me. Happiness gushed from the depths of my belly. My joy was uncontainable. I began to shout my own name at the top of my lungs 7 or 8 times. My name rang out over the horizon over and over. I could not stay still. It was with unsuppressed joy that I began to race back down the mountain. It could have been dangerous, but my steps were natural. My feet were sure. I sped down the mountain with such force. It was my body moving, but not my own body at the same time. I ran down to the town of Atami, where I boarded the train for home. But my world had changed. Everything was now so intensely intimate. Here in this Zendo, instead of enlightenment, we often use the word intimate. Tangen Roshi emphasized that again and again. You don't get something called enlightenment. You become intimate with everything. So intimate. It's my own body. The sun is my own eye. The wind is my own breath. Intimacy. Tangen Roshi, at a very young age, had this experience. Everything was now so intensely intimate. Everything that I encountered was so profoundly close. I remember picking up a small stone beside the path and carefully holding it and turning it in my hands as I encouraged it to be strong and steady. Good, good. Then I laid it carefully back down in its place. A bright and changed world unfolded before me. For 1 or 2 months after that experience, everything, down to the pebbles along the roadside, brilliantly glistened. I thought, it is an intimate, friendly life. I was filled with the knowledge of being together with all things, part of the same life. At the time, I knew nothing of Zazen, but the walls separating me from others had collapsed. My world had become somehow without discrimination, so I felt as if I could even chat with the chirping sparrows. without any theoretical understanding, and without being able to explain what had happened. I had tapped into the very joy of life, and I determined from then on that I would dedicate my life to repaying my gratitude. I returned to the preparatory school where I was boarding. Everything had become different. I had no feeling of dissatisfaction or disharmony with others. I only wanted to help everyone, however I could. Everything was so much fun. I was filled with energy and enthusiasm. At the time, I was living in a dormitory with 3 or 4 other boys. In the mornings, when my roommates and I would get up and they were slow to get into the day, I would bounce up, fold and put away their futons while they got ready, and do my own last. I would be the last one out to put on my wooden sandals, but I had so much energy that I would still arrive at the sports field first. I was propelled by a joyous life force. Then the war began. We were told by the government that Japan was in real danger. We had to fight against enemies who were portrayed by military propaganda as if they were the devils themselves. My perspective was severely limited. I had the sense that I must give my own life to protect those close to me, my parents, my siblings, my teachers, my friends, my fellow countrymen. I was still bound, tied down by a false sense of place, attached to boundaries, to us versus them. I believed that there was an enemy, yet I didn't have a sense of wanting to kill or to save my own life. I just wanted to give my life to protect others. I volunteered to fly as a kamikaze pilot. My goal in life was already to be of service to others, so sparing my own life was not a factor for me. I gave myself to the training that was required. The test was really difficult, geared as it was for university graduates. And this is a note from the translator, Belinda Attaway, who died. She was his regular translator. A student of his for many years. These are the translations of hers, somewhat elaborated because often she cut things down a bit. So they went back to the original teishos that were recorded and filled out places where she had trimmed it. But this is her note, and it goes, Usao, the future Tangen Roshi, was 17 years old when Japan joined World War II. In the later stages of the war, as was true for every man aged 15 to 60, he had to join the army. He wasn't yet a monk then, nor even a Buddhist. When asked later in his life if he would ever go to war, he immediately replied, no, I'm definitely opposed to war. After I began to practice, I came to understand that all beings are brothers and sisters, and even if one were to be killed, one should not kill another. So, going on, the test was really difficult, but I was somehow able to pass. I was only 19, the youngest one in my company. The training was very strict. They didn't give us any leeway at all. The slightest mistake and we were out. They were not worried about the human life involved, but they wanted to protect the airplanes. So to get the license, you had to be extremely careful. We had to line up in front of the military officers responsible for our training, and I was asked, what is your weak point? I answered that I was prone to act on my own authority, to decide on my own to do something and do it. That's not a shortcoming, I was told. When the control stick is in your hand, any number of things can happen, and you have to be able to decide and react immediately. You won't have any time to consult anyone else. You must act on your own authority. So, it's a strength, they said. Then they asked me what my strength was. Acting with resolve, I said. When I commit to doing something, I don't back down or get discouraged midway. I definitely carry through with my goal. But now I see that this wasn't much of a strength, because not knowing what's right, you can carry through with the wrong aim. I see now that not wanting to listen to good advice if there is any available, is ridiculous. Having the right goal is so important. We all wrote our last words, which were carefully folded, wrapped, and carried by the commander of our battalion. I wrote that I was ready to die for my country at any time, not even knowing I might die in training. I felt no remorse. We trained hard, finishing just 1 year a course that should have taken much longer. We were up against a large, strong country with powerful weaponry. Our hastily and poorly built planes were no match in combat for their fine ones. So our battalion was moved to Manchuria, where the pilots would wait for their orders to fly from there. One by one, the pilots would board their airplanes loaded with explosives, take off, and aim for large ships. If just one would hit right, a large aircraft carrier with 100 or so planes could be sunk in one blow. That was what we were studying to do. It was only 5 days after my graduation, August 15th, 1945, that I was supposed to take my final flight. Actually, his first and last flight. Other pilots went before me, giving their lives, and I waited my turn. Since I was the youngest, our commander was keeping me last in line. I had my last ritual sake cup. Just when I was on the verge of taking off, we heard the emperor on the radio announcing the unconditional surrender of Japan and the end of the war. I couldn't believe my ears. I was devastated because I was not able to do anything to protect my country. Later, we learned that we had been deceived by our leaders and that it was Japan who was the aggressor. I was shocked. All my comrades had given their lives, and here I was, still alive. But to what purpose? Nothing made sense to me. It was then that I tasted the bitter pain of living. I suffered the anguish of being alive when so many were dead. Japan surrendered on August 15th. If the war had ended even 1 day later, I would have flown my final flight, and I wouldn't have been able to meet with the teachings of the Buddha Dharma in this lifetime. I was in the 24th company, which is the number of Jizo. The Bodhisattva must have followed me right into the army because I was saved many times. When the war ended, I was sent to a Soviet prisoner of war camp for almost a year. Many of my friends died there. I was working in the hospital, and we had to bury the dead. Yet the ground was so frozen that we couldn't. So many soldiers died there, most of them in their 20s, dreaming of their homelands and their families. Then one day, one of the Soviet soldiers asked me to drink alcohol with him. He wouldn't take no for an answer, so I had no choice but to join him. Since I was so weak and had almost never drunk alcohol before, I got very sick and I was left in bed in the hospital. The next morning, most of my fellow soldiers were sent to labor camps in Siberia, where most of them died. Just on the brink of death again, my life was miraculously spared. I was taken care of. My life was spared over and over, yet I couldn't rejoice in this. I couldn't appreciate it, not yet. I felt only anguish and despair. Those who had died, was their death in vain? Did they die and that was it? What is the meaning of life? These questions stayed with me. They took over my mind. I had to find out what I could do, what was in my own power to do, to somehow in some way make it up to all those young men who had given their lives. I returned to Japan on a boat that arrived at the port of Hakata on Kyushu Island on June 9th, 1946. Meeting Tangen Roshi. I spent the next year in suffering. Just at that time of greatest pain and anguish, a concerned friend arranged for me to see a Buddhist nun. Her name was Sozen Nakasawa Roshi, and she was the top female disciple of Sogaku Harada Roshi. She told me that there was a very wise man to whom I could take my questions, someone who could help me find the answer, to help me understand the meaning of life. She arranged for me to attend the November sesshin at Hoshinji, but because I wanted to go sooner than that, she told me to come and sit the October sesshin at her zendo at Kanonji, in the town of Mitaka, near Tokyo, which I remember she described as more like a hut. When I first met Sozen Roshi, I knew nothing about Buddhism, and I wasn't even particularly interested in it. But thanks to that meeting and to her, I was able to connect with the Buddha Dharma. At Sesshin, Sozen Roshi showed me the lotus posture. Zazen is sitting full lotus. Zazen equals full lotus, I was told. Now, here's one of the reasons initially I didn't want to read this book to you. It's such a Japanese view. We're lay people, we're Westerners. The important thing is, why was I born? Why must I die? Why am I here? How can I be of greatest help to this world? How can I grow up as a human being and realize my own potential for wisdom and compassion? After that, posture is simply an ally to help us do our best in getting to the root of these questions in Zazen, paying attention to this breath, to this koan, to this count, and letting everything go, and realizing the sound of this air conditioner, the pain in this knee, the sweat dripping down the body. Realizing intimacy, that's the point. Full lotus is wonderful. It's a very stable position, and for many years, I sat many sesshin full lotus. I was young. It wasn't a problem. Now most of us have aging bodies or compromised in one way or another. We work with what we have. We work with what's on our plate. It's not like, oh, you can't practice Zen because you can't sit full lotus. I remember being in a sesshin at Mountain Cloud out of New Mexico with Tangen Roshi. And I was sitting half lotus. And I was in terrible pain. My whole practice was pain, pain, pain. I wasn't paying attention to my practice. And at one Doksan, he kind of said to me, it might be worth sitting in a chair. You'll be able to pay better attention to your actual practice rather than just gutting through pain. And he was so right. That sesshin really opened up to the kind of practice I was much more used to in terms of working with koans and coming alive through them. Because I gave up a commitment or an attachment, in that case a foolish attachment, to a particular posture. The posture is an ally, it's not the point. So, it's very Japanese to sit full lotus, and then again, if you spend any time in Japan, you realize you'll hear about Tangen Roshi, but even in Japan, people are much more used to sitting seiza, the Japanese posture, sitting on bent knee, not in a chair. So they should be more used to it, but Tangen Roshi wasn't. Get this. So I did what I was told. I jammed my legs into a full lotus posture, and the pain was intense. I was in hell after 30 minutes. The pain ran through my body as if my legs were being sawed off at the knees. 1 minute was eternity. But what an incredibly good thing it was that I practiced as I was instructed without trying to sneak away from it. Fortunately, I was told to count my breaths. The practice in her temple was to count out loud during sesshin. And I counted so enthusiastically that the glass of the windows rattled. The children who were out playing near the zendo could hear each count. And they came up to the window and peered through the curtain at me. Then I was asked to count in a softer voice. The zazen of even a beginner manifests the whole essential nature. The October sesshin and the teachings about the Buddha way that I received from Soza Nakasawa Roshi had a deep effect on me. It must have been around late October 1947 that I went to Hoshinji, and I was fortunate to be given an audience with the great master who was to become my teacher, Daiun Sogaku Rodaishi, his great teacher. He was tiny, tiny, and very thin, but he had an enormous surging power. I openly talked to him about my problem, asking, I just can't live knowing that there were so many that had to die. What can I do in atonement? He told me that he understood my suffering, that I could come to be at peace, that there was a way to solve the problem of life and death at its root. He said, you yourself, you are still alive, so that you can forever and ever follow the path of giving. You can steadily, evermore, give your life to save others. Even with the death of this body, genuine life continues. There is something that does not die. True nature does not dispense or disperse like a mist. Knowing true life, you can be at peace. If you really want to understand the meaning of life, true life, it will take all the determination and effort that you can possibly muster. You will not realize the truth if your aim is unclear and if your practice is weak. Your resolve must be absolute. You must be prepared to persevere with single-minded conviction and effort. If you can really commit yourself to seeking this truth, to this one important thing, then you can stay here. But if you are not earnest and sincere, if your commitment is lukewarm, if you won't be able to make a complete, whole commitment, then you can go home now. Now again, let me contextualize this. Harada Roshi was a monk. He had always lived as a monk. He didn't have a family, he didn't have relationships. He was totally dedicated to teaching formal Zen. He was also an academic teaching Buddhism at one of the major Buddhist universities. Eventually he gave that up to focus completely on training essentially monks, but he was also open to foreigners, interestingly. And that's how Philip Kapleau got connected with him. But he was looking at this particular person. This is, as in Doksan, the advice that's given is for that particular person. This is not necessarily the same advice that would be given to everyone. It was geared to this person who had come with a particular drive and a particular problem and a particular aspiration, and it was visible to Tangen Harada Roshi who this person was, who Tangen was, who he could be, and that's what he spoke to. It doesn't mean that you can't mature in your practice and start off doing your best and find that later on your best was a lot less than you thought, and your best is still ahead, or is now. There's a great verse in Zen, last year's poverty was not true poverty. Last year there was room for a gimlet, like an awl, to make a hole. This year, I can't even find the gimlet. Our practice deepens. Our practice matures. Our understanding deepens. What was okay enough in our understanding is not okay a couple of years later. Not okay to us. We know it. And now it's not that we go, oh, that was terrible. What it is you see so much more. You find a way to live more in tune with what you've seen. You no longer hold on to that. You realize what you thought was so great was actually kind of trivial. This is how we mature. It's a lifetime practice. Endless deepening, endless path. It said that even Shakyamuni is only halfway there. So this was Harada Roshi's personality meeting Tangen's personality. And they had a certain kind of mind. And of course, when he's talking about enlightenment, he's talking about full enlightenment. He's not talking about a glimpse of self-nature, such as we're going to experience, and then Kensho, and then working through the koan curriculum, through years and years, deepen and broaden that initial glimpse into something much more ordinary and natural and steady. So we'll stop here and see how he takes next time Harada Roshi's advice, what he does with it, and what happens. We'll stop here and recite our great vows for all.